I'm really excited to be here just to kind of be sharing some more in terms of what we're seeing here with AltaML in terms of the sentiment around artificial intelligence and applied AI. As Mac was kind of mentioning, we've launched this applied AI lab about 2 years ago, and the response has been really overwhelming in terms of people that are looking to get into the industry, people that are looking to kind of improve on their skills, and then people that are looking to actually launch in terms of their careers. But with that, we've also seen a lot of things changing. How people actually prefer to approach their data science needs in organizations with how fast, kind of technology has been evolving. Some of the challenges that we're seeing as, kind of companies are trying to approach these different things in terms of, productionalizing or working across different business units. And with that, we also wanted to kind of share, with all of these challenges, with all of these changes, what are some things that we are seeing in terms of people that are kind of setting themselves apart beyond kind of that technical contribution. And so with that, I'll kind of kick off for today. Feel free, I'll also kind of keep my eye on the chat as well. So feel free to kind of put in your name, maybe where you're from and what you're hoping to get out of for today. And I'll try and keep an eye on that. And we'll have a little bit of a question and answer a little bit later. And so, in terms of my career, it's a little bit squiggly, I would say. I've been working in and out of startup companies for most of my career, from kind of that pre-seed to Series A, B2B, B2C. I've seen things fail. I've seen things succeed. And now I'm really happy to be here with AltaML, working on kind of growing the next talent pool in terms of machine learning developers and data scientists. As Mac was also mentioning, I lead our Women in AI chapter for Calgary. And so it's really about elevating the conversation around women in AI and thinking about things kind of similar to this presentation of beyond the model. So thinking about, how you might actually kind of sell a data solution, how you would actually productionalize it, how you might actually bring it into a product, how you might wrap software around it. There's all of these different components within data science, and sometimes it's easy to think just about the modeling component. But we really try and think of that whole breadth. And we're excited to be in the community and kind of sharing different talks and holding different events as well. So that's a little bit about me and my background, but maybe let's get to the Applied AI Lab. So as Hira was kind of mentioning, we're running this initiative. It's over the course of 3 years. We have about 85 associates that have been through the program as well. 95% of them have actually found full-time roles in data science within 60 days, which is something that's really exciting. And we really want to help you kind of either launch or transition your career. And so if you're interested in anything around data and you kind of have these data foundations, feel free to reach out to Hira or to myself, and we'd be happy to chat a little bit more about that. Now let's get to the good part, the promise of AI. So there's been a promise of AI for a pretty long time. And actually, data science has been around since about the 1950s. And so we've seen this time and time again. You'll probably see on LinkedIn, you'll probably see on Forbes and all sorts of articles. AI is really going to kind of transform the productivity and GDP potential. Every single time that you're going to be investing in AI, it's going to give you these returns. And the more that you're kind of investing, we're hoping that you can kind of see the benefits. And then the third part of it is, if you can kind of sprinkle this AI dust across your industry and across your organization, it's going to be able to discover these data and these patterns that, you couldn't have actually anticipated from before. So having AI in your industry or having AI in your organization is going to be really important, because that's what's going to be the transformation. But as anyone that actually works with data science or has worked in an organization that's kind of implementing a data strategy, implementation is really hard. And so, we're seeing a lot of the times that, smaller companies or companies that are kind of starting with data at their core, kind of like Neo, it's a little bit kind of different in terms of their strategy. But with traditional industry, it's not as easy. So when you're working with a company, and I like to give the example of, I think it was the Evergreen or the Ever Given that was in the Suez Canal, and you're trying to kind of turn that or kind of get it unstuck in terms of working through your data strategy, it's pretty tough because it requires a lot of this deep subject matter expertise. We're seeing really now like only 1 in 5 models is actually becoming operational. And so, we're building a lot of models, which is really great, but then how do you actually realize the value? Really kind of coming back to talent. I'm sure you guys have seen all of the articles or have almost felt the same sort of pain in your own company in terms of, finding talent that's industry ready to hit the ground running is really difficult. And it's really kind of hard to fill these positions when you're also competing with sometimes like the FANG companies in the world, where they might be offering like $300,000 or $400,000 for a certain kind of expertise or a certain type of skill level. And so that availability and that access to talent is pretty tough. And then the other part of it is, these large organizations sometimes don't have the mindset. And so I have later in one of my slides, there's so many buzzwords where we talk about digital transformation and industry 4.0 and all of these different things. And, it's great to put it out there. But sometimes, like, are you talking the talk and are you walking the walk, right? And so this is what we're seeing is, there's this great promise of AI, and it's kind of reached this hype cycle, which is great. But, how you're actually implementing it is really, really hard. And it's not as easy as what people may think it might be. And so over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about a couple different things. So evolving models for approaching data science, what we've really seen here at AltaML, and some real life examples. Some challenges we are seeing in the market from some of these approaches and like what we're actually seeing in terms of actually getting things into productionalization or kind of communicating across the business units. And then what types of skill sets we're seeing valuable beyond the technical contribution. And I'll talk to this both from a technical perspective and then also from the business side, because I think it's important to both mention them. And so what I want you to get out of this is I want you to think bigger and I want you to be inspired. I know we have a wide range of people in the audience today. Maybe, you're in a data science role currently and you're trying to take some things back to your business. Maybe you're actually working in a larger company and you might be on the business side. And so I want you to think bigger. I want you to be inspired. And I want you to try and take some of these learnings back into your own kind of personal life or into your organization. And so first, let's talk about some of these evolving models for approaching data science. This is one of my favorites. So to centralize or decentralize, that is the question. And so as I was talking about, data science really continues to be this growing field. And given this, there are different approaches, actually multiple approaches in the industry from how you actually structure your data and how you actually kind of fill out these roles in your organizations. What we've seen is this has become pretty difficult just because of how rapidly data technology has changed over the past 5 years. And there's really kind of this cascading effect between what people are doing. And it's changing actually quite a lot all the time. And so if you think, kind of 10 years ago, I would say one of the most challenging problems that a data science team faced was probably, managing their compute and storing their resources. And as you all know today, that might not even be a blip on the radar. And so when we think about this to centralize or decentralize, this is a key decision that many companies face. And so I'm going to go through a couple of the different ways in terms of which we're seeing kind of companies organize their data science practices or their data science structures. So the first one is really around this decentralized model. And so what you can think about it is if you have a company and you have your marketing, your supply chain, your finance, maybe you have something on the logistics side, every single one of those teams would actually have a little bit of a data science unit inside their organization. And so it's really kind of spread widely across the organization and across the company. The next one is really kind of focusing on this centralized approach. And so here you almost have this like center of excellence. So the center of excellence is really kind of setting the standards, setting the organizational tone. And then they work with all of those different types of business units, of those business lines, as they're needed on a kind of a per needed basis. And then this third one, which I would say is actually becoming a little bit more common, is a hybrid. So you have this center of excellence, but then you also have these teams embedded inside of the different business units. And so I'm going to go through each one with a little bit of a case study and an example. And I want you to kind of put on your lens as well as, like what is my organization doing, or like what have I actually maybe witnessed at other organizations as well. So you can kind of get a little bit of a practical thought behind it. So the first one we're going to talk about a little bit is decentralized. And so I want you to think of an organization potentially like Walmart. So if you think about how large Walmart is, they would be very business unit specific driven data science teams. And so, we're talking about, supply chain, manufacturing, operations, finance. And typically these teams would be a little bit smaller, probably less likely full stacked, but they would be a little bit more attuned to the business and some of their needs. And so they have that ability to be responsive very quickly. So if there's something that's going wrong in terms of like, if they're looking at customer churn, they can actually access that right away. They have the business unit prioritization. So it's not like, okay, we have this backlog of AI use cases and, we're going to get to you when we get to you marketing. And then they'll also have this domain knowledge. And I would say that domain knowledge is really, really important as you're kind of going through, because it's really, really difficult just to understand on the context of the business in terms of what is the model that you're actually building and who will be the end user and how might they actually benefit. Challenges, because everything is kind of decentralized, you might actually have these isolated teams, which can create a lot of silos. I've worked in siloed organizations before. They are not very fun, and it's sometimes really hard with the knowledge there. There also might be a lack of managerial focus. And so sometimes on these teams, you might not necessarily have like a technical leader as kind of the manager. And so when you're getting these different directions on both the business and the technical side, it can be difficult. There also is an inability to really kind of build out these productional systems or these products because you really don't have that full stack capability. So maybe you have a couple data scientists, but do you actually have a software dev? Do you have someone that's on the UX UI side? How are you actually thinking through beyond the model and actually building out a product? And then the other part of it is, the organizational data science strategy. And I put in bold, good luck, because that's something that's really hard when each team is kind of taking their own approach and they're kind of going at it on their own. Like you really kind of get these siloed practices. So like, are you using the same tools? Are you kind of doing things with the same practice? Were you kind of working on the data? This part is really, really important as companies scale and grow because you're going to want to have that centralized kind of ideal on how you approach your practice. The next one is around, the centralized approach. And so here, all of the data resources, so analysts, engineers, data scientists, and technology. So thinking about, the data warehouse, if you're thinking about Power BI, if you think about all the tools, are owned by one central data team. And so if someone, for instance, on the product team or finance team, like has a request, a data related request, they submit it to the data team for this prioritization. And so the benefits of this is you actually have full ownership over the systems management. So how you're approaching, your data warehouse, your cloud, and your security. There's also an organizational strategy. And usually what we see at AltML is you have that executive sponsorship from the top down, which can be really helpful. And then there's also that stronger technical talent management because you have a group of individuals that are learning from each other and you have that ability to share. Usually we're seeing the fact that, people can understand, if I'm going as a data analyst, then I might be going to a data scientist, and then I might be going into a lead, and then I might be going to principal. So there's a little bit more robustness in terms of how the practice is actually built out. And so it kind of allows for that stronger technical talent management. Some of the challenges as you're spread too thin. I feel like everyone probably on this chat or in this conversation can relate to being spread too thin with COVID and all of the projects and all of the great things that are going on. But when you're spread too thin, it's really kind of hard to prioritize in terms of like what project, what are we building? Like, what are the models? Like, what is our actual end goal, especially when you're allocated on a couple different projects, right? If you're not fully dedicated. The other thing is it can be slow moving and bureaucratic. So depending on the different business unit and the different business leader, you might not actually get to work on certain use cases and they might be prioritized differently from kind of a top-down perspective. There also can be a lack of domain knowledge. And so this is something that I've seen specifically as someone, I actually moved here from Toronto about 4 years ago. And so the energy industry is kind of new to me, which seems a little bit silly, but like really trying to understand, oil and gas and trying to understand virtual flow meters, trying to understand all of these things. Like if you're coming into a domain or an industry where you might not necessarily have all that knowledge, it is pretty hard to get up to speed. And so making sure that, if you do have this centralized approach, that you are sharing that domain knowledge or you're kind of making sure that that's something that you're doing on a regular basis in terms of, bringing yourself to that next level is going to be something that's really important. And then the fourth one, which I think is really, really key, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is just that disconnect from the business priorities. And so, you might be coming in, you might be building a model, but, from the business perspective, is that the right model that you want to be building? Who are the end users? What is the actual value for the business? Is is this a problem that actually even needs machine learning? Because that's something that we see all the time is, there's such a need and a desire to kind of sprinkle AI, magic AI dust on everything, but that might not always be the best approach. And so those are just some of the benefits and challenges from what we're seeing. And Macy's is actually a company that kind of has this centralized approach. The next one I wanted to talk about a little bit was the hybrid example. And so I said, Plantier, I think, would be a really good example. And so they have data science teams on the front lines kind of solving these problems for these enterprise customers. But they also have internal teams that are kind of thinking about the lessons in the field, and they're developing these products further and optimizing them while delivering the solutions across different industries. And so with the hybrid model, I feel like you kind of get the best of both worlds. So you have the responsiveness to be agile to the business needs. So as things are coming through, you can actually work through them. It's not something where it has to be prioritized in the queue. You're working in that specific business unit. So you do have that domain knowledge and you do have that understanding of, what's actually going on, and you understand kind of more of that business context. And then you still have that benefit of the systems management. So there is kind of this centralized hub where, you are having all of the systems managed, in terms of like your practices, in terms of data, in terms of your organizational kind of effectiveness. And so everything is kind of in there. And so those are kind of some of the benefits. But sometimes we see in the challenges, depending on what's going on, it still can kind of lead to those isolated teams. So it's really kind of important to have that knowledge share. You might need the domain knowledge. Like I was mentioning, it's also a benefit, but then can also be a challenge. And then there can also be a lot of communication overhead if the business units and the technical management are not aligned. And I've definitely seen this and witnessed this a lot firsthand in terms of, what is the business priorities and what are the technical priorities, and how can you actually get alignment on those two things. And so with that, what works best? I think this is the $1 million question as people kind of are approaching their data science needs and trying to figure out what works best for them. And I would say, there really is no right answer here. And it's really kind of dependent on the broader organizational structure. Centralized teams naturally work for organizations that might not be able to support multiple teams. But then their ability to respond to various domain-specific needs can actually be difficult. And so we're seeing more and more that companies are kind of leaning towards this hybrid approach where they might have had a decentralized approach before, they might have had a centralized approach, but now they're kind of actually trying to transition everything into hybrid where you kind of get the best of both worlds. And so going through that, as you could probably tell from some of the things I was saying is, there's a lot of challenges in terms of what we're seeing in building, ML solutions or building ML projects. And so, machine learning systems are complex. There's a tendency to kind of sometimes just grab a data set, apply various algorithms, and compute and get metrics and get these performance outcomes. But it's not always necessarily that easy in terms of actually getting to that end state or that success metric that you're really kind of looking for. And then often too, there's a disconnect between the people that are building the models and then those that might actually be using them to kind of serve the organization. And so here, same thing. I'm sure you guys have seen, production is hard. And we are seeing a lot of the times that 87% or 90% of data science projects are never actually making it into production. So like uncovering a little bit to see what is going on there, I think is something that's really important. And this is a quote. So before actually doing this presentation, I went out and was talking with a bunch of different people in the community just to kind of really understand their perspective and, what they were kind of seeing. And this one really resonated with me. And so is saying, the business is asking for things we can't do, and the analytics teams are building things that aren't useful. And so I don't know if this resonates with anyone in terms of, their experience and what they're doing. But this is sometimes something that we see all the time is it's not necessarily building the model that is difficult. It's actually how you're taking the model and productionalizing it. And if you actually are building the right model in the first part. And so here, what we're really trying to do is to try and think beyond the model. And so if we do see this disconnect between the business and the analytics practice, and I really love this in terms of like pointing fingers at the end, what are some things that we can actually do to kind of remedy this? Or what are some things we can do in terms of thinking beyond the model? Before we kind of get to that, I think it's good to rewind a little bit. And so, as I was mentioning, data science has been around since the 1950s. If we're going to insert all these buzzwords, digital transformation, industry 4.0, art of the possible, this is not an overnight effort. And so when people are really kind of approaching their data science needs, sometimes they're thinking we can throw money at the problem, we can throw more data science at the problems, but how you're actually working together effectively and collaboratively in a team is something that's really important. And building out machine learning models isn't necessarily like building software, like where you have this agile flow and you can just kind of walk through these steps and we know what we're doing. Like it really involves the business being involved, the end user, so that you can kind of go through this collaborative approach to really kind of figure out what you need in terms of building that model. And so with that, it's really kind of seeing, okay, if we're seeing these challenges, if we're seeing these things kind of happen in terms of how people are approaching their data science needs, in terms of the organizational structure, if we're seeing that, in terms of some of the challenges that, communication is hard and that productionalizing is hard, what are some of these skill sets that we're seeing here at AltML being valuable beyond this technical contribution? And the first thing is first, like you don't actually have to check every box, because I think that's a big thing we see is, like I have to come into this role, I need to check X, Y, Z. That's not necessarily the case. And these are just some things that we would suggest, or some things that we're seeing. First, it's really kind of thinking about this business context. And so before you start coding and before you kind of jump into the things, ask some certain questions. And this is something we really kind of preface and focus on in the lab is like, in the first 2 weeks, you actually don't touch a data set. We actually kind of take you back a couple steps to think about, what is the objective of this business, or what is the objective of this business unit? What is really the problem that we're trying to solve here? Is it something in terms of customer churn? Like, is it important for it to be 60 days? Is it important for 90 days? Is it important to be 30 days? Like, what is that actual core problem? Why is this important to the business? Is this important kind of like at a business unit level? Is it important at an executive level? How are we really kind of defining success? And then who is your end user, or who is actually going to be the person that's going to be using this model at the end? I would say here, the biggest thing is asking questions and not being afraid to ask questions. Because I think it's sometimes easy to come in with like, okay, this is the project, this is what we're going to work on. And then you just are kind of like set in this mode of like, okay, we have to go forward and we have to approach. But I don't necessarily think that's the best thing forward. Is like when you think about a team, usually you'll have, data scientists, you'll have people on the software side, you'll have project delivery managers, you might have someone from the business, and then you're also going to have someone, if you're working with clients, on that is going to mirror that on all the other sides. So making sure that you're asking questions and that everyone is aligned is something that's really, really important as you're kind of going through. The other part of it is really kind of thinking about the users of the model. And so, Brad, I kind of see your question here, just, where does data consumption by the end user fit in your model? For me, it's about the data story, that data-driven decisions make. See, is this where the disconnect resides? I would say that's exactly the right thing there. Where the disconnect really resides is, you're looking at the data, but then you're also looking at like the end user and how they're actually going to use this. And so who is the end user of this prediction, and like, what is their workflow? And so a lot of the times when we're thinking about productionalizing, and you can think about products in a couple different ways, but so you can think about products as like a standalone application. So like maybe it's like an app or like a white label app, or you can also think about a product as like, if you have this workflow and like, you have potentially like some sort of, maybe it's a customer relationship management tool that you're using, and there's just a certain widget that you can implement where it tells you like the satisfaction of that customer. That can also be a product, right? And so if you're not looking to see like, what is that actual end thing or end goal that we're driving towards, that is really where it becomes important. Because a lot of the times what we see is like the business will make assumptions for what that end user really wants, when that end user, what they really want or what they really need to kind of drive value in their business can be completely different. And so, that end user, for instance, is like, how are they actually measured in their role? Like, how do they define success? Like, what is the information that they need in order to be successful, or in order to kind of do their job better, or in order to kind of save time? And usually you don't really talk to that end user. Well, sometimes actually you don't talk to the end user at all, or you don't talk to the end user until the very end of the project, and you realize that, hey, actually, the model that they needed wasn't something on like customer churn in like 90 days. What they actually needed was customer churn in 30 days. And so talking to that end user to understand like what types of data that they actually need and like what types of inputs they need is something I would say that's really, really important. How you're looking at defining value in the workflow, what information does that user need? And then also, how can I design the system so a user wants to be engaged? We've all managed over the last 2 years to use a lot more platforms, whether it be kind of these virtual meetings or whether it be certain types of tools to engage us in collaboration. And so really kind of thinking from an empathy lens of, what that end user might actually need or might actually want and how they might want to engage in the system, I think is really important. We've all used tools that we probably don't like to use. And so thinking through those things, I would think is something that would be really, really valuable. So there's a couple different steps that you can take. And these are kind of steps that we're seeing and we're kind of sharing in the Applied AI Lab and at AltML in terms of what we do with our associates. But the machine learning canvas, I would say, is a really big one. As we were kind of alluding to before, machine learning systems and solutions are really complex. And so this is really kind of a tool to get everyone on the same page, to really kind of understand, what is that goal? So the what, the why, the who, what is the valuable part in terms of that take home. The other part is really kind of creating these user journey maps. And so this is something that's really important. Brad, I think probably in your example, just kind of starting with like, what is the actual prediction or who is that end user and how would their workflow actually change when they use it versus when they don't have that prediction. And so having that user journey map is important, not only for explaining to the user itself, but then also kind of explaining like across the business and across the teams in terms of what that actual journey might be. Wireframing, I think minimum viable products is really important too. Not everything has to be a fully baked solution. I think there's a tendency to perfect everything as you're kind of going through. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Building out like a very simple wireframe to see like, how a user might actually engage, or if they already have a system, how they might take that system and like potentially like add a little bit of a widget in. Those things are really, really helpful because it also helps kind of tell the story. And kind of paint that picture of what that might actually look like. Because sometimes it's really hard to go from a confusion matrix or an R-squared score to actually kind of seeing what something might look like in a product lens. And then same thing with the wireframing is also around building dashboards. And actually one of my colleagues, Ellie, is going to be talking a little bit more about this. But building dashboards to really kind of get that minimum viable interaction with the end user or with that kind of customer, I think is really, really important as you're going through. And then overall, just kind of thinking about the story and thinking about kind of the empathy component. I see a couple more questions in here. Maybe
I'll... Do you want to take some questions, Danielle?
Yeah. Let's do that. Do you want to, would you want to read them out to me and then I can answer?
Sure. I can toss this one up. Just going back a step here. As AI capabilities become more widespread, does the skill of asking good questions of AI become more of a competitive advantage?
Yeah, absolutely, Terry. I think that's a really, really good point. I think asking questions is really, really key here. I have to do it a lot in my role. I'm not trained technically, and like I've done a lot of things to kind of really understand if it's like certifications, if it's reading certain books, and if it's even kind of talking to the team. And I think that there was a really good article that Tiffany from Cement kind of put out, and she said that the art of asking good questions, right? Like, don't ever feel like you're asking a dumb question, or don't ever feel like you're not the smartest person in the room. Like, making sure that you're asking those questions is really, really important because it also gets everyone on the same page. And I feel like 9 times out of 10, when you are asking a question, a lot of people in the other room might have that as well. So asking questions is very important. And I would encourage everyone to make sure that they're asking questions. And I would say it's definitely part of a competitive advantage. Sometimes it's the hard questions, but I also think that's the good questions, right? Like, you want to be able to ask those questions, and you also want to have a good culture where you can have kind of that constructive conflict kind of going back and forth.
That's a great point. And maybe leads into the next question here. What are the challenges you've seen with the reporting structure of these organizational models? So referring to the hybrid and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of challenges when it comes to the reporting structure, because oftentimes what we see sometimes in terms of like the data science practice and in terms of like the business practice, there can be that disconnect like I was talking about. One of the things that we've really started to do here at AltML and that I've really kind of ingrained with my team is, when you're reporting, like you're reporting both like from the technical side and from the business practice side. So then you also get the benefit of mentorship from both, I would say. Because I think that's something that's really important is like sometimes there's a very unique view from each side of the business of like what is actually important and what we need to drive towards. And so just really kind of making sure that everyone is aligned in terms of like what that level of or what that measure of success is something that's really, really important. And because like sometimes in that centralized approach, you could have someone that their manager actually isn't working on any of their projects with them. So they can't see what they're working on. They don't understand like what the business unit's priority is, or they don't understand what's going on from that perspective. And so sometimes that can lead to like a lot of miscommunication. And so making sure that everyone is aligned kind of across the practices, I think is something that's really important. And then also making sure that you're intentional. And so one example I would say is an individual on my team, we have one of our managers of data science is actually, he's leaving to INSEAD. And so I'm pretty sad, but I'm also wishing him the best of luck. But we'll have another manager that's going to be coming onto our team. He's like, well, I'm not too sure. Like, I haven't talked to him yet. I'm like, well, how come you haven't talked to him? He's like, well, I don't know. I think maybe I should wait for him to book a meeting with me. I'm like, well, just book a meeting with him. Like, like it's okay. Like, right. So like making sure like if you even are concerned about things or even have worries, it's like making sure that you kind of take that initiative and take that first step. Because I would say a lot of times you find that, people are pretty accepting and like they want to be able to talk and want to be able to understand like where you want to go and what your next steps are.
That's a great point. I think that disconnect can be a limiting factor in any kind of motion, right? Next question, I think, which leads into that well, maybe what are some of the challenges with the hybrid model? In terms of the limitations, I think, because leading in from challenges to limitations, obviously it's great to say the best of both worlds. Where do you think that there maybe is a limit there?
Yeah, I would say the limitations really on the hybrid perspective is just if you don't have that executive alignment. Executive alignment is really, really key in a hybrid situation because like you're going to have like both this organizational, like this center of excellence, but then you're going to have also all of the business units kind of with their own priorities. And so making sure that, if we're talking about digital transformation, industry 4.0 and being a data-driven organization, like everyone needs to be aligned to that. Like it can't just be something that's done off the side of your desk. And like I see a lot of the times there's a lot of lip service where people want to talk about it, but then do they actually want to do it? And so I would say one of the biggest limitations around the hybrid model is like that executive alignment and that executive sponsorship.
That's a great point. I think that also, again, leads into the next question here. Where does the data consumption by the end user fit in your model? Maybe a comment or two around the storytelling involved with data-driven decision making.
Yeah, so I would say, and this is something that was come up like actually the last 2 weeks in some of our projects. The data consumption, and maybe if I'm understanding this correctly, what I would say what we usually try and do is almost like have this like minimum viable interaction. So if, for instance, with a certain model, we're getting a certain output, what we try and do is have this interaction. We'll put it in a certain type of product or a certain type of environment where this end user can actually consume this information. And then they can see it's almost like an A/B test over the course of like 1 to 2 weeks. Like, is this information actually like helpful for them in their day-to-day jobs? Or would they need something else to actually kind of add value in their workflow? I would say that the data-driven decision makers are really kind of what I see as like the people like at the end of the line, the end users, or else, why else are we kind of like building this? But I would say that minimum viable interaction, which also can be hard to do depending on what types of business you're in, right? Because if you're in a business where like everything has to be perfect before the end user can actually see it, or, as an end user, like, or as a customer service representative presents as an example of an end user, you can already have a lot on your plate. So like, is this just other noise? Like, how do we look at this A/B testing? Like, what does it actually look like? And how are we defining success? Like, there's so many parts of the business that actually have to be aligned on like how you're building products and like how you're thinking about data before you can kind of actually start going out and doing it. And I have a very like scrappy, like I would say agile mentality because I've really only ever worked in startups and scale ups. And so I'm used to just kind of like, okay, like let's push this through. Like, let's just see, like, let's get the end user, like, let's see what's going on. Let's pilot, let's test. And if we fail, we fail. That's okay. But sometimes in it's a little bit more difficult in these traditional or larger enterprises because, you know, the way of working and the way that they've always done things has been very concrete. And so sometimes pushing these things through can be a little bit different. And so it really kind of comes back to everyone being aligned on like, you know, what are we doing? Are we going to be a data-driven organization? And how are we kind of all working together?
Yeah, that's a great point. Everyone says to fail fast until they fail sometimes, right? So
yeah,
large corporations. So I totally get that. Maybe skipping ahead here, how does technology play a role? And I think this question centered around cloud, but I think it'd be great to understand how AltaML leverages some of the, you know, obviously technology that's in the market today, keeping in mind some of those bigger players.
Yeah, for sure. I would say in terms of technology and cloud and even like kind of channel partners. So with AltaML, we have a couple different channel partners. So it could be the major cloud providers. So if we're talking about Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, even companies like Databricks, and I know that their CTO and co-founder is speaking tomorrow, which is very, very exciting. But I think technology plays a big role. I think gone are the days where you need to build a custom model from scratch all the times. A lot of these organizations have spent like hundreds of millions of dollars of actually building out these solutions. And so usually they're about 70% to 70%, and then you can take the last 30% to get it all the way. But I would say that in terms of, you know, working with these different channel partners on AltaML's perspective of this is really quite valuable because a lot of the times, you know, they've been working with different companies for a while. They have a really good established relationship. They have the tools, they have the technology, they have the training. We're doing like in the lab, we actually do like Microsoft comes in and does some training with our associates, which is something that's really exciting. So really kind of that relationship, I would say, is very fluid and goes back and forth, but is really kind of beneficial for the both. Because sometimes you'll see that, you know, Microsoft, if we're working with a client, they might be actually able to come in and fund some of that pilot, which is something that's really excited because we're working on their platforms and we're driving some of their consumption. And so I would say, you know, we have a great relationship with a lot of the major providers, which is great, but understanding and utilizing them is something that's really important. And I would also say that's something important from the business perspective, right? So like business leaders also need to think technical, right? If you're going to talk the talk, you better walk the walk. And so making sure that from the business side, you also understand what's going on in this cloud environment, you know, how people are managing their data and looking at their data practices, and also the kind of the machine learning and AI that sits on top.
That's great. Maybe I'll do one more question and then we'll let you finish your presentation and take the rest at the end. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think this is like my second last one. So yeah.
Perfect. We can keep going then. Excellent.
Okay.
How do you organize your teams when providing your consulting services to your customers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So what I would say is we always have someone usually in from the business development side. We'll have project delivery managers. We'll have someone that really kind of understands from the business solution consultant perspective. And then we'll have kind of our data science team. So everyone kind of works together in this agile kind of flow. Obviously, it's not exactly agile because the approach to data science is a little bit different in terms of like we're kind of having that iterative cycle of like, you know, you get the results, you talk to the business, and then you tweak, and then you get the results, you talk to the business, and then you tweak to really kind of find that best outcome. But I would say it really is kind of this blended team approach. And we do the same thing with our clients, I would say. It's not like you know, like I'm trying to think of like, you know, when you're maybe in your MBA where you just like you work on a project and then you're like, okay, my project's done, and then you hand it over. That just doesn't work, right? And so we really work closely with our clients to have this blended approach where, you know, we're also working with your project delivery teams. We're working with your product teams. You know, we're working, if you have an analytics team, we're working with that analytics team too. So we have that blended approach as we're going through so that it's not necessarily like we've done this work and this is great, and then we throw it over the fence and then you have to decipher it to try and figure out what's next. It really kind of is this blended approach.
For sure. And I think that's a great kind of segue into some of the other talks this week around or this weekend around model ops and DevOps and kind of the whole
Yeah.
continuous delivery perspective, right? I think that's great because you never just hand off something and hand it off to the business and let it be, right? It always involves the team that built it for a long time, if not ever, right?
Yeah. And especially too, like a lot of the times what we see is like, you can have a very incredible technical person that can go through and that can actually build out a model, but then like, can anyone else like read it? Can anyone else understand it? Is it explainable? Is it modular, right? Like those are all of the things that are really important when you're actually building out these systems is like, do they have the readmes, right? Like, can someone else understand it if they need to go in and tweak it? Like those are the things that I think are really important.
For sure. Maybe just, I see one more question in the chat here. I'll just put it up. How do semantics factor into a hybrid model?
Maybe semantics in what point? Can I get you to expand on that?
Yeah, I would take it on the factor of how do you think maybe some of the internal politics play into a hybrid model? Obviously, I think that gaining, trust in and building out teams is tricky, right?
Yeah. I'm like, let me be careful on how I answer this. I would say semantics are definitely everywhere. There definitely is like a lot of bureaucracy, like when you're working through certain systems and then when you're working with teams. I would say the best way that I've ever seen it set up though is it was really like top down in terms of it being driven. Like, okay, if we're focusing on digital transformation, if we're focused on like actually becoming a data driven organization, it wasn't something where all of a sudden it was like off the side of someone's desk. Like it was actually a part of their mandate. And so when it's a part of your mandate, it's also something that you're measured on, you're evaluated on. It's something that like is part of your key success metrics. That's when I've actually seen it be done the best. And so there's one of the companies that we work with, and I can't name them, but they have an innovation lab. And so with the innovation lab, every single business unit like has a specific mandate to work with the innovation lab to get products to work like through them, and they're meeting monthly. And so it really is kind of that top down approach, because you can try and work on it like through the bottom up, but then sometimes you're getting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And then it's like, okay, this is really great from a proof of concept, but like, let's bring it into a pilot. But then like, who has the money to fund that pilot, right? Like which business unit does it come from? And like, actually, is this under training or is this under this? And so I find that when it is that top-down approach and like it's actually part of your mandate and it's a part of your role and it's part of how you're measured in success, that's when I really kind of see these models, and particularly the hybrid model, become a lot more successful. But then it also can't just be lip service, which is something that I see all the time too, right? Like, I think that's something that's important.
Maybe to elaborate on that a little bit, what do you see as the quickest or easiest way for the analytics teams within an organization to build trust with the business?
I think it's asking questions. I think it's going back to Terry's question. I think it's really about asking questions. And I also think it's a two-way street, right? Like, I think it's both the business asking questions, and I think it's also, the analytics teams asking questions about like, what's going on here in terms of like, who might that end user be? Or like, really, what is the problem that they're trying to solve, right? That question asking and really understanding the context of what's going on is something that's really important. And like, this is something that I've had to do a lot, even in my role. And so like, now I can work my way around like a Jupyter notebook. Like, I understand the environments that we're working in. I understand in this. And so I think it's asking questions, and building trust, and like also engaging in empathy. I think that's a really big thing too, is like, you might not know everything, but like you're trying to understand and you're seeking to understand so that you can do your role in a better way.
That's great. That's a great point. Another one here. With predictive analytics, how do you recommend to manage the risk of using the model to make data-driven business decisions, specifically after the pandemic and the situation in Europe?
Oh, yeah. I think this is a really good point. And I think it also kind of comes down to, responsible AI and ethics and looking at data. We actually just did a panel on this with Women in AI on Wednesday, just trying to really understand, managing this risk and what it actually looks like from the data perspective. I think this question could unfold a lot. So maybe Esmeralda, I'll take it. I can take this one offline with you if you're okay with that.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's what we've got in the chat for now here. Maybe I'll let you finish up and we can see if any more pop up.
Okay, awesome. I think I only have a couple more, or it might be it. Yeah, digging in and talking with the team. Okay, so putting it all together, models are really kind of evolving in terms of like how we approach data science, and I think it's something that's really exciting. And I think that the time for change is now, which is something that's great. How we're working on it as a team, how we're coming together as a business, it's definitely a collective effort, and making sure that we're not having any of these silos is something that's important. Communication between both the business, the analytics team, and the customer is essential. Without that communication, I think this is where a lot of things fall down, both internally and externally. So having that communication, asking those right questions, even asking the hard questions, like don't be afraid to ask those. I think that's important. And then the last thing is just kind of thinking beyond the model. How are you thinking about, what might be the end product? How are you thinking about the end user? How are you thinking about the context of the business in terms of what this is being built? These are all really important things in terms of thinking through kind of data science and analytics.